Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here today to continue reading Journey to the River Sea by Eva Ibbotson, illustrated by Kevin Henkes, and published by Puffin Books. We're going to pick up where we left off with Chapter 8, right after Maya had finally met Finn, the son of Bernard Travner, and she had been taken to see his hut that he lived in and all of that. Chapter 8. Clovis had come up the river in an old tramp steamer, which carried everything from cattle to timber. He had paid the last of his money to the captain, who had allowed him to crouch on deck between a crate of bleeding nanny goats and a sack of leaking maize. But he wouldn't put Clovis off at the carter's landing stage. Bad place, he said. And he made Clovis get out onto an old jetty higher up and walk back along the bank, so that by the time that he reached the bungalow, he was scratched and tired and very hot. But now, as he made his way up the gravel path to the house, his spirits rose. It was so neat and tidy and quiet. No chickens to give you fleas, no barking dogs running the length of their chains. Dusk had fallen and 2 of the windows were lit up. Clovis walked quietly towards them and looked in. He saw a most comforting sight. The Carters were having supper, sitting around a large table spread with a clean white cloth. He could see Mrs. Carter, a kind-looking, plump woman in a blue dress with frilly sleeves, serving something onto pudding plates, a pink blancmange. Clovis could see it shaking in the little dish, and his mouth watered. Shape, his foster mother had called it. She made it with strawberries and cornstarch and milk fresh from the cow. Opposite Mrs. Carter was her husband, a thin man in gold-rimmed spectacles, and facing him was the twins. They looked just the way Maya had described them on the boat, pretty and dressed in white with ribbons in their hair, and beside them Maya. The twins were pretty, but Maya was special. With her serious face and kind eyes, he could see her pigtail looped over her shoulder. Just looking at it made him feel safe, as if he could hold on to it and be all right. Miss Minton didn't seem to be there. Perhaps it was her day off, and she'd gone to visit friends. He stood and looked a little while longer, unseen by the people in the room. It was a good name for this house. Tapperini, a place of rest. Then he went round to the side of the house and knocked on the door. It took only a few moments to shatter Clovis's dream. First came the violent shrill of an alarm bell. Then a maid with a sullen face led him to the dining room and opened the door, and the twins looked up at him, stared at him, and exploded. It wasn't laughter that came from them, not really. It was that awful giggling, that high-pitched, merciless twitter that had spread across the footlights in the theater and set the other children off. Clovis recognized him at once. It was the twins' laughter that had hounded him. "Oh," gasped Beatrice, "it's little Lord Fauntleroy." And then both girls said, "Will I have to stop being your little boy?" in a deep and growly voice, and repeated it, their voices getting lower and lower, and in between they choked and spluttered and patted each other on the back and started taunting him again. Clovis stood perfectly still by the door. He looked at Maya to see if she too was going to join in, but she looked horrified, and now she jumped up, came to stand beside him. "Don't," she said passionately to the twins. "Please don't. Can't you see?" Mrs. Carter now took charge. "All right, girls," she said to her daughters. "That will do." And to Maya, "Sit down, please. We have not yet finished our meal." But it took some time for the twins to quiet down, and they still growled and gulped, and then Beatrice said, "Look at Maya protecting her boyfriend." "Enough," said Mr. Carter, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. It was the first word he'd spoken at the table, and it was to be the last, but the twins now managed to control themselves. "Now," said Mrs. Carter, staring at Clovis, "might I ask what brings you here?" Clovis looked at the soft, rounded face. Close up, it did not look kind and motherly as it had through the window. He felt that under the puffy cheeks one would find stone. "I wondered if I could stay with you for a few days. We have to leave the hotel, the Paradiso, all of us, and I thought..." Maya now turned to Mrs. Carter and stretched out her hands to her as if she were begging for her life. "Oh, please, please, Mrs. Carter, couldn't he stay? He could have my room, and I'll go and sleep with Miss Minton. I'm sure Mr. Murray would help him to..." "Stay?" Mrs. Carter interrupted in a horrified voice. "Stay with us?" said Beatrice. "We don't have actors to stay, do we, Gwendolyn?" Both twins shook their heads slowly, left to right and right to left. They reminded Maya of the women knitting by the guillotine during the French Revolution, while heads rolled into baskets. Heaven knows what he might have picked up in the Paradiso, said Mr. Carter. And to Clovis, she said, what are those bites on your legs, fleas or bedbugs? Clovis flushed. There were bedbugs at the Paradiso. He minded it just as much as Mrs. Carter, but it was true that he no longer looked like a boy wonder of this stage. It had been impossible to get hot water at the hotel. His long hair was unwashed, his clothes were too small for him, and stained. We can't just turn him out, said Maya desperately. I hope you don't think we can take in every verminous stray that comes to the door. The boy must go back. Beatrice, go and fetch Miss Minton. I'll go, said Maya quickly. No, I asked Beatrice. But Gwendolen, who wouldn't even go to the bathroom by herself, had slipped out after her sister. Maya had not sat down again. She stood beside Clovis as though she could come between him and his misery. And its bowl in the center of the table, the pink shape, which had looked so good through the window, had sunk into a watery mush. Miss Minton appeared in the doorway. Good evening, Clovis, she said. Clovis took a step towards her. Good evening, Miss Minton. She looked just as she had looked on the boat, sharp-faced and strong. He'd liked her from the start. She was fierce, but she was straight, and for a moment he was sure that she would be able to help him. Please take the boy out and order Furo to take him back to Manus at once, ordered Mrs. Carter. Oh, not tonight, begged Maya. Surely tonight. I hope you are satisfied, making us use the boat and wasting fuel on a runaway boy. Miss Minton gave Maya a quelling look. That will do, Maya. Come along, Clovis. Really ashamed of you putting the Carters to so much trouble. Clovis shook off her arm and gave up hope. I'll come by myself, he said. If Miss Minton, too, was his enemy, then there was nothing to be done. Left behind in the dining room, Maya was still on her feet. Please, can I go to my room, she said. Certainly not. You will finish the meal. Maya took a deep breath. I feel sick, she said. Miss Carter looked at her. She did indeed look very pale. Miss Carter weighed the possibility of a disgusting mess against her desire to punish Maya. Very well. You may go to your room, and stay there. The two Englishmen had returned from upriver in a very nasty temper. They had spent 2 days on a boat with piglets and chickens and an old woman who was seasick, even though the river hardly moved in the still heat. There were no bunks, only hammocks strung on deck, and Mr. Trapwood fell out of his in the middle of the night onto an inspector of schools from Rio who was not pleased. Even worse had befallen Mr. Lowe, who had decided to have a swim when the boat stopped to take on more wood, and come out of the water to find a dozen blood-sucking leeches feasting on his behind. And when they got to the Umbuda, there was no sign of Bernard Travers' son. The interpreter, whom Colonel De Silva had sent with them, was very helpful. He went ahead to the chief of the tribe and greeted him in his own language, said that Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood were important people who had come from Great Britain to search for a missing boy. But what he also said in a low voice was that these two gentlemen were being a great trouble to the colonel, who begged the chief and his friends to tell them some story about a lost boy which would keep them quiet and make them go away again. The Umbutta chief and his friends were only too pleased to do this. They did not like Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood, who had not brought any of the presents one usually brings when visiting a tribe, fish hooks or knives or cooking pots, and they loved making up story. They told them about an English boy, fair-haired and beautiful as the sun, who had been there but had wandered away. Where to? Asked the crows eagerly. Where did he go? In the direction of the sacred mountain, said the chief, pointing to the north. No, in the direction of the Mambuto forest, said his second-in-command, pointing in the opposite direction. Forgive me, father, said the chief's young son, but the boy went to the river, and he pointed somewhere different again. Ask them when this was, said Mr. Trapwood excitedly. So the native people and the interpreter talked amongst themselves. Then they went to a hut on the edge of the clearing and fetched out an old woman. The old woman wasn't just old, she was ancient, with arms and legs like sticks and not a tooth in her head. But when the chief explained what he wanted, she grinned happily and said, yes, she remembered the boy well. His eyes were as blue as the blossom of the haraconda tree, and his hair glistened like the belly of the golden toad that squats on the lily leaves of the Mamari River, said the old woman, who was having a good time. His skin was as white as the moon in the season of... Yes, but when? When? Interrupted the crows rudely. When was he here? The old woman sat down on a stump and began to count. She used her fingers and her toes and then some pebbles on the ground, and the chief and his friends helped her. Then she winked at the interpreter and said it had been 50 years ago. What? Shouted Mr. Trapwood. 50 years ago? She nodded and said yes, she was sure, because it was when she was a very small girl and still had all her milk teeth in her head. And the native people nodded and also said yes. She had often told them of the lost boy who came when she was no higher than the tail of a swamp deer. And then they led her back into the hut, patting her on the back while she giggled with glee. So the crows had to give up, but they could not leave because the boat back to Manus was not due for another 2 days, and they had a very uncomfortable time staying with the Buddha, who drummed a lot and seemed to live mostly on nuts. That the tribe was sharing their food and shelter very generously did not, of course, occur to the crows, who had been brought up to think of the native people as savages. By the time they returned to Manus, the Englishmen were not in very good shape. "I've had enough of this," said Mr. Trapwood as they sat in their room in the Pension Maria overlooking the docks. "So have I," croaked Mr. Lowe. "This business has got to be settled. The bishop goes back in 10 days' time, and the Taverner boy is going to be on it." "If he exists," said Mr. Trapwood gloomily. "Of course he exists. You saw the letter." "Well, why doesn't he come forward, or anyone else?" "Do you think we ought to increase the reward? The old chap said that we were to use our judgment." "I suppose we might as well. After all, it's not us that's paying it. What we need now is a thorough house-to-house search of the buildings outside the city. If Taverner was a naturalist, he probably wouldn't live in the middle of town, and they may not have seen the notices out there." "I'm sure that chap at the museum knows something," said Mr. Lowe moodily, "the one that said Taverner didn't have a son." Then the little Brazilian maid brought them their supper, which was the same as lunch and the same as breakfast: brown beans stewed with pig trotters. Mr. Lowe dug about in it gloomily, looking for bits of gristle, and Mr. Trapwood found a dead ant on his plate. It seemed to be a perfectly clean ant, but he gagged and pushed his plate away. "This place is closer to hell on earth than anywhere I've been," he said. On the morning after Clovis had been turned away from the house, the hairdresser came out from Manus to do Mrs. Carter's hair. At first he was silent and surly, but when he found that Mrs. Carter meant to pay him at last, he cheered up and gave them all the news. The actors had been thrown out of the Paradiso and had gotten hold of a van and were trying to get out of Brazil through Venezuela, where the British consul was supposed to be good-natured and inclined to turn a blind eye. "But everyone thinks they'll be stopped at the border," said Monsieur Claude. "Poor Clovis," said Maya when she heard this. The twins shrugged. "He's only an actor," said Beatrice, "a vagabond. They're used to wandering about." "Clovis isn't," said Maya, but she said no more about him. Since Clovis had been taken away by Miss Minton, she had been quiet and subdued, scarcely speaking to anyone. But the piece of news that interested the Carters most was that the reward for the discovery of the Taverner's son had been doubled. "It's 40,000 mirais now," said the hairdresser, crimping Mrs. Carter's curls. "They've put up notices everywhere." "Imagine the dresses one could buy with that," said Beatrice. "And the hats," said Gwendolen. "And the shoes, and the chocolates. Boxes and boxes of chocolates." "You could buy something a great deal more useful than that," said Mr. Carter. "A pair of glass eyes from Queen Victoria's piano tuner, for example. He had seen them in the catalogue. Or he could pay off that shark Gonzales, from whom he'd borrowed money and who was always pestering him. There's a new kind of wallpaper that stops insects from landing on it for 20 years, said Mr. Carter wistfully. "I read about it at the dentist." For a moment all the Carters stood with narrowed eyes, thinking what they would do with so much money. And on the following day, the Crows arrived at the bungalow. They had chartered a boat belonging to a wealthy merchant and landed at the Carters' jetty while the children were doing their lessons. Mr. Carter was out bullying his workers somewhere, but when he saw the boat, he came in quickly. Mrs. Carter brought in Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood in the dining room, where Miss Minton was giving the twins dictation. "Fetch Maya," she ordered the governess. "These gentlemen want to question everyone." The Crows sat down, twitching their black trousers up at the knees so as to keep the creases in. They liked the Carters' dining room, the smell of Lysol, the shrouded windows, a decent British household at last. Maya was brought in, and she recognized them at once, and the twins saw that she had turned pale. Mr. Trapwood did not waste any time. "Some of you know what I'm already going to say. We have come from England to find a missing boy, the son of Bernard Taverner. It is now very important that he is found and brought back before the bishop sails. The reward for news of him has been doubled. Now I want you to think very carefully whether you may have any idea of where such a boy might be hiding." Maya looked up. "Why is he hiding? Why doesn't he come forward? Why doesn't he want to go back to England?" The Crows frowned. "Whether he wants to go back or not has nothing to do with it. The boy must go back, and at once. It is a matter of life or death." "If we tell you something useful, will we get rewarded?" said Beatrice. "Certainly." The twins looked at each other. "We think Maya is hiding him," said Beatrice. "I had a toothache last night, and I woke up and I saw her sneak out to the end hut where the rubber workers used to live, the one that was empty." "We don't know for certain, but that's what we think," said Gwendolyn. "She goes outside sometimes when she's supposed to be in bed." "No, honestly, that's nothing to do with—" Maya had jumped from her chair. "I don't know anything about the boy you're looking for." "All the same, I think I might ask these young ladies to take us to the hut they described. Have I your permission, Mrs. Carter?" "Certainly. But if Maya has been deceiving us, she will be most seriously punished." Miss Minton had come to stand beside Maya. "If Maya has really been hiding someone, she will certainly be punished. But I find this hard to believe. It isn't Bernard Taverner's son, honestly." But it was too late. The crows had risen, and now everybody moved out of the bungalow, down the side path, and towards the huts of the native people. Furo, Tappy, and old Lila were standing outside their door, looking in silence. Miss Minton had taken Maya by her arm, as if she expected her to run away. Her nutcracker face was closed and angry. Mrs. Carter moved past the huts as if she were walking through an open drain, and the twins held their noses as they passed the potbelly pig. "Please," began Maya, and stopped as Miss Minton's steely fingers dug painfully into her arms. "Be quiet, Maya," she said. The hut was locked, but that didn't help them. Mrs. Carter shouted to Tappy to bring the key. Tappy disappeared into her hut. She was away a long time, but eventually and sulkily she brought the key. "Empty," she said to the crows. "Not inside. Nada. All gone away." "We shall soon see," said Mrs. Carter, and took the key. Maya bit her lip and stared at the ground. The lock was stiff. "Give it to me," said Mr. Carter, taking the key from his wife. He fumbled for a while, then managed to turn it. The door swung open. There was a loud screech and a flutter of black wings, and a trapped bird flew out, sending Mrs. Carter reeling backwards. Then silence. On the floor of the hut was an old blanket, a candlestick with a spent candle, and nothing else. The hut was empty. Nobody in the Carters' bungalow slept well that night. The twins lay in bed thinking of the money that had escaped them. "I was going to get that blue silk cloak in Florette's window," Beatrice sighed. "It wouldn't suit you, the neck's too low." They began to argue, but then remembered that neither of them could buy the cloak. "All the same, I think Maya knows something. Did you see how worried she looked when they were opening the hut? She's just the sort of person who would be on the side of a runaway. Look how she tried to shelter Clovis. But the Taverner boy isn't just a runaway. He's a criminal. He must be, or they wouldn't be so keen to catch him. Well, I'm going to watch Maya. I don't trust her at all." In their bedroom down the hall, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, too, were thinking of all that could be done for the reward for the capture of Taverner's son. "We could go back to England for a visit. I'm sure Lady Parsons would be pleased to have us stay." Mr. Carter didn't answer. For one thing, he never spoke to his wife if he could help it, and for another, the last thing he wanted to do was to go back to England. He had left his job in the bank there in a hurry, quite a big hurry. If he had stayed even a few days longer, the police would have come for him because he had borrowed money that did not belong to him. And out here, he was getting behind again with certain payments. The 40,000 meal raise would have helped clear his debts. They wouldn't have cleared them all, but they would have helped. Mrs. Carter was frowning, thinking of Maya. "I don't really trust that girl, and the governess favors her." "Well, if you send her away, we're done for," Mr. Carter said. "I owe that rogue Gonzales 3 batches of rubber, and I haven't got one." "How can that be?" "You wouldn't understand," said Mr. Carter wearily. He sighed and reached for the lamp, but Mrs. Carter got up once more and took her flit gun from under the bed. She was almost sure that she had heard something buzzing by the window. Maya had put on her dressing gown and had crept down the corridor to Mrs. Minton's room. She had brought her hairbrush, but the 100 strokes were just an excuse. She was perfectly capable of brushing her own hair, but she had a confession to make. "But where could he have gone, Minty?" Maya asked after telling her unsurprised governess about Clovis. "The actors aren't here anymore, and he doesn't know anyone else in Manus. I'm so worried about him." "He won't come to any harm," said Miss Minton, brushing steadily. "He's quite a sensible boy, really." But Maya could not see it like that. When Miss Minton had taken Clovis to the boat, it was with the idea of telling Furo to take him to the Kaminskys. She was sure now that Mr. Carter never sent the cable to Mr. Murray, and she hoped to ask Sergei's family to take Clovis in for a while. The Russians were well known for their hospitality, and in the end, surely the British consul would do something for the boy. But Furo, with much hand-waving, had explained that the Kaminskys had gone away for 2 days to visit their farms in the north, and when she turned round, Clovis had disappeared into the darkness. Miss Minton had asked no questions, not even when she saw Maya creep back from the deserted hut which had housed the rubber gatherers. Till the Russians returned, there was nothing she could do, and now the boy had vanished. The next day was a Sunday. On one Sunday in the month, an English vicar came out to conduct a service in the next village upriver from the Carter's house. Mrs. Carter liked church. The twins in their pretty dresses were always admired. She heard other English voices. In England, they had sometimes been allowed to join Lady Parsons in her pew. She had expected Maya to accompany them, but the girl looked peaked and wretched and had been sick in the night. Mrs. Carter was displeased. She seems to be making a habit of it. I hope it's not infectious, she said to Miss Minton, who shook her head. She knew exactly why Maya had been sick. She was worried about Clovis. She had been sick after she came across a native person being flogged on Mr. Carter's orders. I think she needs a quiet morning by herself, said Miss Minton, and was told that it was her duty to accompany the twins. We don't want people saying that we can't afford a governess, said Mrs. Carter to her husband. So the family disappeared upriver in the launch. Maya noticed that it was not Furo who was steering the boat, but it was not until Furo came himself and beckoned to her that she allowed herself to hope. Come, he said, as he had done the first time, and Maya got up quickly and followed him. Her sickness had gone. She felt hopeful and excited. If this was the summons from Finn, perhaps he would know what to do. This time she was not asked to put on a blindfold, and at this sign of trust her spirits rose further. When they came to the green wall, she could make out the opening now that she knew it was there. It wasn't much more than a change of color in the green as the rushes took over from the undergrowth. She closed her eyes to protect them against the branches. Then they were through, and she was in the lagoon again. Even before she saw Finn, she felt like she was coming home. The dog wagged his tail, properly this time, nothing too gushing. He was not that kind of dog, but he remembered her. She jumped out onto the jetty. Finn's hair was coal black, as it had been the first time he saw him, and he wore his headband. He was in his disguise again. But he looked relaxed and untroubled, and when she thought of the crows, she found herself shivering. They've been at the Carters, she said. The crows. I know. And of course he would know. He knew everything. And you've lost your little actor friend, he said, grinning. Furo had paddled to the entrance, and Maya followed Finn into the hut. He had a bowl of fruit on the table, avocados, prickly pears, nuts, a melon. Her mouth watered, but she turned her head away, angry with Finn for speaking so carelessly of Clovis. Yes, I'm so worried about him. He came when the twins jeered at him, and Mrs. Carter said he had to go back. But the actors had gone, so I hid him in the stone hut. I thought I'd get Mr. Murray to pay his fare, but he hasn't. And the crows came. They made me open the door. They thought it was you I was hiding, but he'd gone, vanished. He'll be all right, said Finn. His casual tone annoyed Maya. That's what Miss Minton says, but why will he be all right? He's got nowhere to sleep and no money. Thinking about Clovis and how she had let him down brought her to tears, and she brushed them away angrily. Clovis was her responsibility, not Finn's. Finn had trouble enough of his own. But Finn had seen her distress. Come and see the Arabella, he said. I've cleaned the funeral. Walk carefully, there's some wet paint. She followed him out on the little launch. Have a look under the awning, said Finn, but don't make a noise. She moved forward quietly. What strange animal had Finn brought back aboard and tamed? Someone lay sprawled out on the deck. He lay on his back, limbs thrown out loosely. He was so still that he might have been dead, but he wasn't. He was deeply asleep, so asleep that even when Maya bent over him, he didn't stir. He'll sleep for a bit, said Finn. I gave him something. He's a nice boy, but you're right. He does cry a lot. You mean you've drugged him? Maya was shocked. It's only masharana leaves, said Finn. Old Lila used to give them to me in a drink. It's quite harmless. But Maya was not altogether pleased. You seem to know a lot about herbs and medicines. And dyes, she added, looking at Finn's hair. The native people taught my father, and he taught me. That's how we live partly, finding new medicines. Then they went back and sat on the jetty, and he explained what he had done. Furo told me that the crows were on their way, and he told me about Clovis being in the hut. He thought you'd get into awful trouble from the Carters, so I fetched him away in the night. The dog lay quietly between them. Two swallowtail butterflies chased each other over the lotus leaves. Actually, Finn went on, I've got an idea, I told you. I'll explain when I've woken Clovis. He looked up at the sun. He'll be awake in half an hour. Better make some tea and serve it nicely. Clovis likes things done properly. Teacups with saucer and no bugs in the bread and butter. Finn was right. Clovis woke up in exactly half an hour, looking refreshed and well. He, too, liked the hut. I wouldn't mind living in a place like this, he said, helping himself to a biscuit. Well, that's a good thing, said Finn, because you're going to. For a few days, till just before the bishop sails. Clovis looked up, his eyes full of bewilderment. I'll explain, said Finn. I thought, you see, that you could take my place. The crows don't know what you look like, and they don't know what I look like. If Maya will do what I ask her, I think it could be done, and then you'll get safely to England, and I'll get away. Maya stared at him. But you can't. You can't send Clovis back to a prison. Finn was bent over the dog, steadily scratching the space between his ears. I think it's time I told you about Westwood, he said. Chapter 9. It might easily have been a prison, began Finn. It had towers and a moat and battlements, and it stood in acres of land ringed by high stone walls stuck full of spikes. But it wasn't. Westwood was a large country house, a stately home which had belonged to the Taverner since the time of the Crusades. The head of the family was a stiff-necked, snooty landowner, Sir Aubrey Taverner, who brayed at people and spoke to the servants as if they were deaf. Sir Aubrey's eldest son was called Dudley, and he was exactly like his father, arrogant and sooty and certain that the Taverners were the most important people on the earth. Dudley, too, shouted at the servants. He went off to his prep school without a murmur. He rode horses with large behinds. He shot things, and of course he was the apple of his father's eye. The next child born to the Taverners was a girl whom they called Joan. She wasn't much good in some ways because only males were allowed to inherit Westwood, but all the same she was a true Taverner with a voice like a foghorn. Joan bullied the other children who had bad luck to not be Taverners, and she too rode about on horses with large behinds, and Sir Aubrey liked her well enough. Then came Bernard. Bernard was the last of Sir Aubrey's children. His mother died soon after he was born, and he was a disaster. Bernard was afraid of loud voices. He was afraid of the dark. He was afraid of his brother, Dudley, who tried to make a man out of him, and he was afraid of his sister, Joan, who threw him in the lake and held his head under the water to make him swim. When Bernard spoke to the maids, he did it quietly and said please and thank you, and sometimes, though he was a boy and a Taverner, he cried. His father, of course, was desperate. A boy like Bernard had never happened in his family before. He sent him away to the toughest school that he could find, but though the teachers caned him more than his father had done, and the boys did interesting things to him, like squeezing lemon juice into his eyes and piercing the soles of his feet with compass needles, it seemed to make no difference. Bernard went on being quiet, and he went on being terrified of his family, and he went on saying please and thank you to the maids. But there were some things that Bernard was not afraid of. He was not afraid of spiders. When the servants screamed because there was a large one in the bath, it was to Bernard they went, and he would put a glass over it and let it in the garden, admiring its furry legs and complicated eyes. He was not afraid of the adders that hissed on the moor. He liked the adders, with their zigzag markings and flickering tongues. Bernard did not mind the rats in the cellar, and he did not mind the horses. He minded the people on the horses, his sister Joan with her braying voice, and his brother Dudley with his whip. But if he met the horses quietly in a field, he got on well enough with them. It was one of the maids who showed him that there might be a way of escaping from Westwood. She was an ugly, gawky girl, not much older than Bernard, and as much of a misfit among the servants as he was among his family. Bella was always reading the book she should have been dusting and was constantly in trouble, but she was the only friend Bernard had. There's people who make their livings with animals, she said. Naturalists are called. You could be one of them. From then on, my father knew what he wanted to do, said Finn. He wanted to get as far away from his family as possible and go live with animals. When you know what you want, you usually get it. It took Bernard 7 years. And all that time he said nothing to anyone, but saved every penny he could. He saved his Christmas money, and he saved his pocket money. He never bought so much as a lollipop or a chocolate bar. And slowly, very slowly, his hoard built up. The maid who was his friend hid it for him in the cage of a stuffed owl in the attic. And all the time Dudley went on bullying him, and his father went on beating him, and his sister Joan went on jeering at him. But now Bernard had somewhere to go inside his head. Then a month after Bernard's 16th birthday, Sir Aubrey came down to breakfast, and so did Dudley, and so did Joan. They helped themselves to kidgreen and scrambled eggs and kidneys and bacon, and then Sir Aubrey rang for the footman to bring fresh coffee and said, "Where's Bernard? The wretched boy is late again." But Bernard wasn't late, he was gone, and no one from Westwood ever set eyes on him again. He caught a banana boat bound for Brazil and traveled up the Amazon and was happy there as he had been in wretched England. As happy there as he had been wretched in England. He had been terrified of the butler, but alligators didn't trouble him. He made friends with the native people and found it easy to make a living as a collector. The only time that he was unhappy and afraid is when he was asleep in his hammock and dreamed that he was back in Westwood or at school. And when Finn was born, he decided to bring him up to love and respect the native people and never let anyone drive him back to his old home. And so the years passed. Sir Aubrey rode off his youngest son, who was probably in a gutter somewhere, and served him right. Dudley was the best person to inherit Westwood. Then, something awful happened. Dudley was killed in the hunting field. The horse was all right. People were glad of that because it was a good horse, but Dudley wasn't. He broke his neck. Sir Aubrey was exceedingly upset. Who would take over from him when he was dead and looked after Westwood with its 2 lakes and its 3 woods and its farm, and who would give orders in the house with its 47 rooms? He thought about this, and then he decided what mattered was that whoever it should be should have the Taverner blood. Sir Aubrey was very keen on blood and always had been. His daughter Joan had it, of course, but she was married to a man called Smith and already given birth to 3 daughters, one after another, and daughters were no good. It was only males could inherit Westwood. Sir Aubrey decided to give her one more chance. Joan lived on the edge of the estate. If her 4th child was a boy, he would leave Westwood to him, though of course he would have to change his name to Smith Taverner. But it was not to be. When the midwife came out of Joan's bedroom and said, "It's another lovely little girl," Sir Aubrey was driven away from his daughter's house in a dreadful temper, and for weeks people were afraid to speak to him. But then a brave old lady, a second cousin, came to see him and said, "Don't forget, Aubrey, you still have another son." "If you mean Bernard, he's not my son any longer. He was an ungrateful, cowardly scoundrel, and if he darkens my door again, I'll take my whip to him." But the cousin said blood was blood, and why didn't he try to find Bernard? And after a while, Sir Aubrey saw the sense of this. Blood was blood. There was no getting around it. Better that Bernard should inherit Westwood than a total stranger. Only where was Bernard? They put an advertisement in the Times and a lot of other newspapers, asking Bernard Taverner to come forward, and he would hear something to his advantage, but for a long time nothing happened. Then, when they had almost given up hope, they had a letter from the editor of a magazine called the Naturalist, which was published in New York and printed learned articles about animals and plants. This is what the editor wrote. "Dear Sir Aubrey, I have been to see in the Times of last October a request for information about Bernard Taverner. Taverner was a regular contributor to my journal, an outstanding naturalist, an observer of wildlife. I asked him for a piece about a manatee, a rare South American water mammal, and instead of his article I received this letter from his son, which I enclose. Dear sir, I'm very sorry, but my father, Bernard Traveler, died 2 months ago. His canoe overturned in the rapids and he was drowned. I'm sending back the check you wrote to him because it belonged to him, and anyway, I am too young to have a bank account. Yours faithfully, F. Taverner." Needless to say, this letter caused great excitement. "By Jove, he had a son then," said Sir Aubrey. "Well, our problems are solved. We'll send for the boy and train him up to run Westwood. Shouldn't take long to knock him into shape. No reason to suppose he'd be a namby-pamby like his father." How to find the boy, though, was another matter. There was no address on the letter, and the only thing that the editor knew that it was that Bernard's mail went to a post office box in Manus. "It's not where he lives, though," he wrote. "He was always traveling. I believe he had a native wife." But this Sir Aubrey refused to believe, and said he wrote 2 letters addressed to the son of Bernard Traveler, one to the post office box in Manus, and one to the care of the bank manager who had looked after Bernard's account. In both letters he explained what happened at Westwood, and said that the way now was open for Bernard's son to come back and take up his inheritance. Finn received the letters and did not answer either of them. Instead, he began to get the Arabella ready for her journey to the Zante. Nothing Sir Aubrey had written had made him feel that he could ever return to his father's home. Sir Aubrey wrote again and then sent a cable, and then losing patience, he got in touch with the director of the firm of Wesley and Keenar, private investigators, and asked them to send 2 of their best men out to the Amazon to find the boy and bring him back. And 2 months later, the Crows arrived in Manus. In the hut beside the lagoon, Finn had fallen silent. Then Clovis said, "Are you sure you wouldn't rather go back to be the master of Westwood, rather than..." He broke off as a capuchin monkey screeched suddenly in the trees. "Rather than live like a savage?" finished Finn, grinning. "Yes, I'm quite sure." Maya, too, had wondered. Sir Aubrey must be an old man by now. Finn would probably be able to stand up to him better than his father had done, and when he died, Finn could take over and do anything he liked with Westwood. "Let's get this clear," said Finn. "Whether you decide to help me or not, I'm never going back to Westwood. Never. And if the Crows come here to this place, I'll shoot them and I'll go to jail. This was my father's sanctuary, and they're not going to set foot in it." Maya and Clovis looked at each other. At times like this, they remembered that side of Finn. "So how does it work?" said Maya. "The Crows find Clovis and think he's you?" Finn sat with his hands around his knees, frowning as he thought. "I want them to find Clovis just before the boat sails, late on the night before, if possible, so that there's no time to trail him around Manus. Someone is sure to recognize him from the theater. But How? They must know by now that I don't want to come to England, that I'm trying to hide until they've gone. So I will hide, somewhere near the docks. But my hiding place will be betrayed. They'll hear that a boy is hiding and come to grab him in the night. Only it won't be me, it'll be Clovis. If Maya gets the timing just right, they'll find him just before the boat sails and take him straight on board. If I do what? Betray me. Give me away by mistake. It's no good going to the police. They're on my side. You must let it slip to someone who's sure to go to the crows. Someone who will do anything for money. Who? Oh, for goodness sake. Surely it's obvious. Maya nodded. Yes, she said sadly. The twins. I'll explain it all properly. It will work, I promise you. Yes, what will happen if they find out I'm not you, said poor Clovis, who had turned pale. They won't, not till you get to England. Not even then, if you don't want them to. I'll give you a sealed letter saying I bullied you into taking my place, that I threatened you with torture. It takes 6 weeks to get to England. If you can hold out for another week or two at Westwood, that will give me plenty of time to get away. By the time they find out, I'll be with his auntie and you can go to your foster mother. Where is Clovis going to hide? Asked Maya. I've got a good place near the harbor and absolutely safe. You will have to set it up because Clovis and I must stay here out of sight. But Clovis was looking very doubtful. What was the food like? Where? Asked Finn. At Westwood. Did your father say? Finn shrugged impatiently. No, but it'll be the usual British stodge, I expect, he said, looking at the bowl of fresh fruit he had picked that morning. Steak and kidney pies and suet pudding and dumplings. Really? Suet pudding, do you think? Clovis said wistfully. My foster mother used to make them with treacle. He thought of the Goodleys off to Colombia and Peru if they weren't thrown in jail. And it wouldn't be hot, he said. No, it certainly wouldn't be hot. Westwood's in the north of England. They've got lots of snow. Snow, said Clovis, his eyes dreamily. Not that I'll be staying. And then, all right, I'll give it a try. That's where we're going to end today. We'll pick up tomorrow with chapter 10. We've been reading Journey to the River Sea by Eva Ibbotson, illustrations by Kevin Hawkes, published by Penguin Books. I hope that you'll join me tomorrow for another chapter. Once again, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Thank you for listening. Bye.